You're tuned into Collateral Damage, the military families FAP and IDC leave behind. Voices have been altered, because in this system, honesty has a price. Let's jump into episode 13, CPS versus the Military Family Advocacy Program who really protects families?
Navigating systems that are supposed to help families, well, it can often feel incredibly complex, right? And confusing.
Definitely.
Especially when those systems seem to operate by rules you might not expect or, rules that are fundamentally different from maybe what you're used to.
Yeah, you think you know how things should work, but then you run into something totally different.
Exactly. And we've heard from quite a few of you, our listeners, with questions and concerns specifically about the military's Family Advocacy Program, FAP.
Right.
And how it functions. Or sometimes the questions are really about how it doesn't seem to work like the civilian systems people might be more familiar with, like Child Protective Services or CPS.
Absolutely. It can feel like you're trying to navigate a completely different legal or administrative landscape, maybe. And that uncertainty, well, it can be deeply unsettling for the families involved.
And that sense of navigating distinct, maybe even conflicting systems is precisely what we're digging into today. We've got some source material right here that takes a really direct side-by-side look. It compares the military's Family Advocacy Program, and specifically including its Incident Determination Committees, the IDCs.
Right, the IDC part is key.
Yes, comparing that with Civilian Child Protective Services, CPS.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to unpack the key distinctions that are laid out in this material. We want to zoom in on how these two systems approach fundamental concepts that, frankly, matter to anyone potentially interacting with them.
Things like due process.
Exactly. Due process, legal safeguards, transparency. By looking closely at what the source says about these areas, you, the listener, can hopefully get a clearer understanding of why these systems are, well, fundamentally not the same.
And what those differences actually mean for military families who might be navigating allegations or, seeking support.
Yeah.
I have to say, reading through this source material, the comparisons it draws are pretty stark. They really highlight some contrasts that might be surprising if you initially assume these systems were just sort of military and civilian versions of the same basic thing.
And what's fascinating here, and the source makes this very clear right from the start, is the core distinction it draws. One system, CPS, is firmly rooted in the civilian legal framework. It's designed for child welfare under state and federal law.
Okay.
The other, FAP and the IDC process, as this source describes it, is a military administrative system. It operates under Department of Defense policy.
Administrative versus legal.
Exactly. That foundational difference sets the stage for pretty much everything else we'll talk about and has really significant implications for families.
Okay, let's unpack that fundamental difference then. What's the absolute core distinction this source highlights about the very nature of these two systems right from the beginning?
Well, the source lays it out pretty plainly. CPS is characterized as a civilian child welfare system. It's governed by state and regional governments. It's bound by specific child welfare laws, federal mandates, and critically, it operates with established family court systems.
Where judges make decisions.
Right, where judges make legal decisions. In contrast, the source describes FAP and the IDC process as purely a military administrative system.
Okay.
Its governance comes from Department of Defense policy, not civilian law or court oversight. This administrative nature, distinct from a legal framework, is what the source points to as the absolute starting point for understanding all the subsequent differences.
So you're talking about completely different rule books and authorities pulling the strings from day one. The source really emphasizes jurisdiction here, state and civilian authority, versus the Department of Defense and military installation authority.
Yeah, it's huge.
Why is understanding that initial jurisdictional difference, as highlighted by the source, so crucial to grasping the rest of the comparison?
Because, as the source explains it, that dictates the entire legal and procedural framework. It determines what rules apply and, crucially, what rights are afforded or perhaps, not afforded within each system.
Ah, okay.
That difference in underlying authority and jurisdiction is the core reason their processes, the protections they offer, and ultimately their outcomes diverge so significantly, as the source details point by point.
It's the difference between navigating a system governed by law and courts and one governed by internal policy and the command structure.
Precisely.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and frankly quite concerning based on what this source lays out. The document dedicates a significant amount of space to due process.
Yeah, this is central.
It feels like this is where the rubber really meets the road in terms of individual rights. What does the source say about the difference in how investigations are conducted and the fundamental rights individuals have in each system?
This is arguably the most significant contrast this source highlights, and it's presented as a central issue, like you said. The source states that CPS involves civil investigations focused on child safety, right?
Yeah.
And crucially, these investigations are subject to established legal rights.
Legal rights like what?
Well, it points out rights like receiving formal notice of allegations, the ability to have formal hearings where evidence is presented, clear processes for appealing findings, and ultimately judicial review within the civilian court system. These are mechanisms built into the legal framework.
Okay, standard legal stuff.
Yeah, standard, but important. Now, in stark contrast, the source states that the FAP and IDC process is described purely as an administrative review of allegations.
Administrative review, not legal.
Correct. And this is the part the source emphasizes as critical. Due process within FAP is described as being limited or absent.
Limited or absent? Wow.
Yeah. The document explicitly states there is no formal hearing, no attorney, no evidence disclosure required for the subject of the allegation within this military administrative process.
Wait, hang on. No formal hearing, no attorney, no evidence disclosure required. That sounds like a massive fundamental difference in the basic protections someone might expect when facing serious allegations. Allegations that could impact their family, their career, everything.
It's a huge difference highlighted by the source. It suggests that without these basic components of legal due process, the subject of an administrative review doesn't have that structured opportunity to hear the specific evidence against them, present their own evidence or witnesses, or have legal counsel advocate for them during that crucial determination phase.
It just contrasts so sharply with the rights you typically have in a legal setting.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about challenging a finding if you disagree? If FAP makes a determination you think is wrong, what does the source say about appeals?
Another major difference, according to source. It notes that CPS generally have a clear process for appealing findings. This can include formal administrative hearings and, importantly, the possibility of judicial review.
Meaning a court can look at it.
Yes, a civilian court can examine the decision. For FAPADC, however, the source states the process for appealing is often unclear or internal only, with no external review guaranteed.
So if this administrative process makes a finding you believe is incorrect or unfair, the path to challenge it through any external body, like a civilian court, seems murky or just not guaranteed at all based on this source.
Precisely. The process, as described here, remains largely internal to the military administrative structure.
Wow.
And the source also points to a significant difference in the standard evidence used.
Okay, how so?
CPS typically uses the preponderance of the evidence standard, meaning is it more likely than not that abuse or neglect occurred? And the source notes that in civilian legal systems, there are defined legal thresholds for what actually meets that standard of proof.
Right. There are rules about what counts as evidence and how much is needed.
Correct. The source describes FAP standard, however, as undefined and inconsistent. It specifically notes that findings can rely on perception or incomplete reports.
Rely on perception or incomplete reports. That sounds incredibly subjective, especially when you contrast it with a legal standard like preponderance of the evidence, which requires a more objective weighing of presented facts.
It does sound subjective.
The source seems to be pointing out a potential for findings to be made without a clear, measurable standard of proof. Is that fair to say?
That's exactly the implication. The source highlights that without a defined standard and potentially relying on perception or incomplete information, the basis for a finding could feel arbitrary or inconsistent compared to a process requiring adherence to established legal standards of evidence.
Okay, moving on slightly. Transparency is another critical area this source points out as drastically different between the two systems.
It is, and it ties back to due process, really.
How so?
Well, the source notes that in civilian CPS, there's typically a degree of transparency. Families often have the right to request investigation records, understand what information was gathered, and agency decisions are usually documented and accessible to them.
That makes intuitive sense. I mean, if a system is investigating your family, you'd want to know what information they're using and what's being recorded about you, right?
Absolutely. You'd want access to your file.
Yeah.
But what does the source say about transparency within FAP?
This is where it gets concerning again. The source states that in FAPEC, records often withheld.
Withheld.
Yeah. And even more concerning, it says that parties may not know what evidence was used or even what allegations were investigated.
Wow. So you might not even know the specific concerns or allegations that triggered the whole thing, or what information the final determination was based on.
That's what the source claims. And this directly circles back to those due process issues we were just talking about.
Definitely.
It seems incredibly difficult to respond to or potentially challenge findings if you don't even have access to the basic details of the case against you, which is what the source implies happens frequently.
Yeah, it severely limits the ability of individuals to understand the basis of the findings or, advocate for themselves within that process, according to the source's description. It's hard to defend against unknown accusations or unseen evidence.
Let's shift slightly to what the source identifies as the core purpose or mission of these two systems. This feels like it might explain some of the structural differences we're seeing. What's the primary mission difference it identifies?
The source presents a really clear distinction here. It says CPS's primary mission is fundamentally to protect children and preserve families when safe.
Okay.
It's described as being child-centered, with a focus on ensuring the safety and well-being of the child, working towards family reunification when possible and safe, and providing services to support families. That's the goal.
Child-centered. Got it. And FAP.
FAP-IDC, however, has a different primary mission, according to this source. It is framed as being about managing risk to the military institution.
To the institution.
Yes. Its purpose is stated as being to protect military readiness and manage family violence risk. The source explicitly describes it as institution-centered.
Institution-centered.
Right. It highlights that while safety planning is certainly part of it, the primary drivers appear to be command notification and the administrative labeling of individuals or families based on perceived risk. The source contrasts this directly with the child-centered focus of CPS.
Institution-centered. That really shifts the perceived goal and priority compared to a system explicitly focused on child welfare and family preservation first.
It's a fundamental difference in perspective, according to the source.
And the source also mentions that FAP appears to blend support functions with surveillance.
Yes, that's another point the source makes. It says FAP blends support and surveillance. It notes that services, which you might assume are there purely for family support, may actually be withheld if someone has been administratively labeled as an offender within the system.
So the support might not be unconditional.
It suggests it creates a dual role that can feel punitive rather than purely supportive, potentially.
And the source highlights military command involvement as a key part of the FAP process. How does that work?
Absolutely. The source states that command is informed and involved early in the FAP process, sometimes even before determination is made.
Before a finding is even reached.
That's what the source says. And it explicitly notes this is not the case in civilian CPS, where command, if involved at all, would typically only come in much later, usually after some formal legal process or finding.
So FAP brings command influence in right away.
Exactly. This early and direct command involvement, according to the source, brings military authority and potential command influence into a process dealing with very sensitive family matters, which is structurally just very different from the civilian system's approach.
Okay, the source also gets into the structure of how investigations are handled and who is actually doing the work. This seems like another area where due process and the potential for fairness could be significantly impacted.
Yes, absolutely. The source highlights what it identifies as a potential conflict of interest inherent in the FAP structure itself.
A conflict of interest? How?
It states that in CPS, investigation and service provision are often handled by different units or sometimes even external contractors.
Right, keeping them separate.
Exactly. That separation of roles is a common practice in social work and legal systems intended to create objectivity. The idea is the people investigating allegations aren't the same ones responsible for providing support services to the family, which helps avoid bias.
Makes sense. But in FAP?
But in FAP, according to the source, the same office investigates and provides treatment.
Oh.
The source suggests this structure creates a conflict of interest because the entity making the administrative finding is also the one providing or directing mandatory services based on that very finding.
Investigating and providing treatment from the same office.
Yeah, it's easy to see how that could raise questions about objectivity in the initial determination.
It certainly could muddy the waters. And what about the basic rights families have during this process, beyond just the hearing or attorney issues we talked about?
Well, the source notes that in CPS, families may have legal representation, and the ability to formally contest findings through legal avenues. But in stark contrast for FAP, the source explicitly states some really concerning procedural practices.
Like what?
It says, subjects are often not interviewed, not notified of outcomes, or denied a chance to respond.
Wait, not interviewed during an investigation into your family, not even notified of the final outcome or the administrative finding, and denied a chance to respond to allegations or evidence.
That's what the source claims can happen.
It directly undermines any notion of a fair or participatory process. How can someone present their side or even know the final decision affecting them under those circumstances? It seems, based on this source, that a military member could be administratively labeled without ever having a meaningful opportunity to be heard or even know what the final determination actually was.
It significantly limits the subject's ability to engage with the process or influence its outcome, according to the source's description. It paints a picture of a very one-sided administrative process at times.
And what about oversight? Who's watching the watchers here?
Good question. The source discusses the oversight and accountability for the personnel working in these systems. You could call it ethical oversight.
Okay.
CPS staff are typically licensed social workers, therapists, or caseworkers. They're bound by national and state ethics codes relevant to their specific professions. Their licenses are subject to oversight by civilian licensing boards.
Right, there's professional accountability.
Yes. The source says FAP may include licensed providers, but, and this is a key point it makes, many FAP personnel are GS employees or contractors with no oversight by civilian ethics boards.
GS employees. Government civilian.
Civilian employees, yes, or contractors.
Cool.
And the source emphasizes that there's no guaranteed ethics enforcement for many of these personnel.
What does that mean practically?
It means, according to the source, that actions taken by some FAP personnel might fall entirely outside professional licensure requirements and the external accountability that comes with civilian ethics boards.
So, potentially less external accountability for the individuals making these significant administrative findings. Findings that can impact military careers, housing, assignments, family life, everything.
That difference in oversight seems like a significant point the source is making about the accountability mechanisms, or lack thereof, within the FAP system compared to the civilian one.
It really does. Okay, and finally, the source contrasts the actual power and limitations of each system. What can they actually do?
Right, the ability to issue orders or take legal action.
Yeah.
Well, CPS, being part of the legal system, has formal authority. It can lead to child protection court involvement, where judges issue legally binding orders. It can make formal legal findings, and crucially, under court oversight and following legal standards, it can even lead to the removal of children from a home if deemed unsafe by a judge.
It has legal teeth.
It has legal teeth, backed by the courts. The source states very clearly that FAP, as an administrative system, cannot issue legal orders.
Cannot issue legal orders.
Its authority is administrative, internal to the military structure. It can only refer cases to civilian courts for potential legal action if laws were potentially broken, or refer its administrative findings to military command for administrative action.
Like disciplinary measures.
Things like that, yeah. Impacting assignments, promotions, security clearances, or even leading to separation from service based on the administrative finding. But FAP itself doesn't issue the legal orders.
And the source also notes there's no court oversight for FAP's administrative process itself, right? Unless there happens to be a separate parallel civilian legal case.
Correct. The administrative FAP process generally operates outside of judicial review, according to the source.
And the source even points out that FAP often refers serious cases to CPS anyway.
Right. Which, as the source indicates, kind of underscores that FAP primarily functions as an administrative process. It might identify concerns, but it often relies on the civilian legal system CPS and the courts for formal legal intervention or protection measures when things get serious.
So, putting it all together, according to the source material, even though both systems might deal with really sensitive issues like child maltreatment or domestic violence allegations within families, the system itself, its foundation, its rules, its due process, its transparency, its accountability structures, and its actual power, they're just worlds apart.
Yeah, the source's summary drives this home very clearly. CPS is described consistently as child-centered, rooted in a legal framework with clear appeal rights and judicial oversight, and its workers are typically accountable to civilian licensing boards, often with those separated investigative and service roles we talked about.
Okay, that's CPS as described here. And FAP as described in this source. How does it summarize FAP?
FAP, according to the source, is portrayed as a military administrative process, primarily focused on risk to the force and institutional readiness. It's described as having limited legal protections, often unclear or internal-only appeal rights, with no external review guaranteed.
Right.
The source highlights potentially no guaranteed ethics enforcement for many non-licensed DoD personnel involved, and it often combines those investigative and treatment roles, which the source suggests creates a potential for bias. And critically, it lacks its own legal action power, frequently referring cases to CPS for formal legal steps when necessary.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener, particularly if you're part of a military family? This deep dive into the source material comparing CPS and FAP-IDC really reveals fundamental differences. Differences in their structure, their core purpose, and most importantly, the legal safeguards and due process protections afforded to families interacting with them.
What's really striking here is how the administrative nature and the focus on military readiness in FAP, as consistently described in the source, contrasts so sharply with the legal, child-centered approach attributed to civilian CPS.
Yeah.
And this difference in the foundational framework, as the source highlights repeatedly, leads directly to the significant discrepancies we've discussed regarding things like due process, transparency, oversight, and accountability.
It really underscores that just because two systems address sensitive family issues, it absolutely does not mean they operate under the same rules, have the same priorities, or offer the same level of protection to the individuals involved. The source makes a very compelling case that they are structurally and functionally distinct entities.
Yeah, and this raises a really important question based purely on the source's description. Given that the Family Advocacy Program, as this source material portrays it, functions as an administrative system, often lacking formal legal due process, external oversight, separation of roles, and perhaps guaranteed external ethics enforcement. What is the true recourse? What's the path to a fair resolution for military families who believe they have been unfairly treated or labeled within this specific system?
That's a heavy question and something for you to consider. Based on this source's analysis, what are the implications of having serious family allegations handled by a system that is primarily administrative, largely internal to the military, and, according to this source, lacks many of the standard legal checks and balances that are inherent in a civilian court process? What unique challenges might military families face when navigating such a system where, as the source explicitly states, due process is described as limited or even absent?
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more real stories and critical insight into the failures of the Military Family Advocacy Program. You won't want to miss what's coming next.